The ledger's warmth followed him everywhere. It pulsed against his chest as he returned to his apartment, the city around him looking ordinary, but Richard knew better. New York had become a threshold, a stage for forces older than comprehension. The shadows lingered at the edges of perception, patient, watching. The fourth task began with a new message, appearing across the first page of the ledger in letters that shimmered like liquid silver. Understand the origin. The debt is older than the blood that carries it. Knowledge alone will not suffice. You must confront the root. Only then can balance be approached. Samuel is the key, but also the lock. Richard's stomach sank. He had survived fear, faced illusions, confronted the betrayer, but now he had to understand. Comprehension, he realized, was the true trial, and Samuel would be central to it. Hours later, night fell again. The apartment darkened, but the ledger glowed steadily on the table, illuminating the room in a soft golden hue. Richard opened it. Symbols rearranged themselves, forming a map. Not a map of streets or even countries, but of connections, nodes, and pathways, lines drawn between names, events, dates. Bloodlines, promises, debts, and failures intertwined. The ledger's pages pulsed more insistently as he traced the lines leading to Samuel. Each node he touched caused a ripple in the shadows around the apartment, bending reality slightly. He understood now. Samuel was both agent and inheritor of this debt, bound to Richard not by choice but by necessity. Then the room grew colder. Shadows pooled in the corners. And Samuel appeared, stepping from the darkness, exactly as he had in Lagos, impossibly still. "You understand now," Samuel said, voice calm but sharp. "The ledger did not make you. The ledger showed you. It shows all who carry this weight." Richard's hands trembled. "Why me? Why my family? What is this debt?" Samuel's eyes gleamed. "It is older than your mother, older than your grandmother. It is an obligation made in desperation, a life exchanged for a life. Your blood carries responsibility for survival that was never yours to choose. But you have the power to resolve it." The ledger pulsed violently, the light casting Richard's own shadow long and fractured against the walls. The room filled with whispers, voices of ancestors, of those who had made and suffered under these debts. They spoke of sacrifice, of promises made under duress, of bargains struck with entities that moved beyond understanding. "You must choose," Samuel continued. "Take the ledger, learn fully, and carry the debt consciously. Or reject it, deny it, and watch as it spreads, consuming more than you imagine." Richard felt the weight of the choice crush him. Fleeing had never worked. Ignoring it had nearly destroyed him. He realized that true survival meant embracing the ledger, embracing the debt, and confronting the forces that had shaped his life without consent. He lifted the ledger, its warmth now a steady, alive pulse. He spoke aloud, voice steady despite exhaustion. "I will learn. I will carry what must be carried. I will face what has been hidden." The shadows recoiled. Samuel nodded, a faint smile breaking the cold mask. "Then the path forward begins. Not yet complete, not yet safe, but begun. Knowledge is power, Richard, and you must wield it wisely." The ledger's pages shimmered, revealing hidden truths, ancestral contracts, and the mechanics of debts passed through generations. Richard realized he would need guidance, patience, and courage to navigate what lay ahead, but at last, he was no longer blind to it. He had taken the fourth step: comprehension, acknowledgement, and conscious acceptance. And somewhere in the dim light, the blind woman's voice whispered, serene and certain, "The debt watches, always. But now you watch it in return. Balance begins with understanding. Endurance follows knowledge. You are no longer merely prey, Richard Olabode Richardson. You are a participant." Richard exhaled slowly, clutching the ledger. The shadows lingered, but no longer pressed in with malice. They waited, patient, observant, respectful, in the way a forest respects a human who has finally learned its paths. The journey was far from over. But for the first time, Richard felt the faintest glimmer of control, Night had fallen over Brooklyn, yet Richard's apartment felt suspended outside ordinary time. The ledger lay open on the table, glowing softly. Each page now throbbed with a life of its own, revealing not only debts and contracts, but the intricate web of cause and consequence spanning generations. He understood at last that survival had never been just about money, fear, or betrayal. It was about acknowledgement, choice, and courage. And now, the final test awaited. The shadows shifted, coalescing into the shape of Samuel. But this Samuel was not the man Richard had known, neither fully real nor entirely spectral. His eyes glimmered with a knowledge that was ancient, patient, and unyielding. "Richard," Samuel said softly, almost mournfully, "this is the culmination. You have survived fear, endured illusions, faced me, and comprehended the debt. But comprehension alone is not enough. You must act. One final choice determines everything." Richard's throat tightened. I don't understand. What do I have to do?" Samuel gestured toward the ledger. Its pages now revealed a single, unbroken thread connecting Richard to himself and to forces older than memory. "You must decide. You can take the ledger fully, absorb the debt, accept the responsibility, and wield it consciously. Or you can reject it. If you reject it, the debt will not die. It will spread, finding new vessels, consuming those unprepared. Innocents, families. You will have condemned others to pay for what your blood was chosen to bear." Richard's hands hovered over the ledger. His mind flashed back to Lagos, the forest, the hood, Samuel's betrayal. He remembered the blind girl's words, "You carry something you should not. It follows you like a second skin." He realized now what she meant. This debt was never optional. It had been passed down, inherited, and redirected toward him because of blood, lineage, and circumstance. "You make it sound inevitable," he whispered. Samuel shook his head. "It is inevitable only if you refuse. Choice is the only path to control." The shadows stretched toward him, but instead of malice, there was expectation. Every whisper of the ledger, every pulse of crimson and gold, urged him to act, to decide. Richard took a deep breath and spoke, voice firm. "I will accept it. I will carry it. I will learn everything the ledger can teach me, and I will use that knowledge to prevent the debt from harming those who do not deserve it. I will endure." The shadows recoiled, dissolving into soft pools of light. The ledger pulsed brighter, warmth spreading through Richard's chest like a heartbeat syncing with his own. Samuel smiled, genuine for the first time. "You have chosen wisely," Samuel said. "Knowledge tempered by responsibility. Endurance guided by morality. This is the only way forward." The ledger's pages shimmered, revealing the final secret. The debt was not merely financial or corporeal. It was a force of consequence, of unfulfilled promises, of lives intertwined through desperate choices. By accepting it, Richard now held the power to direct it consciously, to balance what had been mismanaged for generations. The blind woman appeared once more, standing at the periphery of the apartment. Her eyes were clouded, yet her presence radiated calm. "The ledger will test you endlessly," she said. "But you have taken the first true step, conscious choice. You are no longer prey. You are a participant. The debt will not control you, not entirely. That is your victory." Richard sank into his chair, exhausted but resolute. The shadows had not vanished, the ledger had not relinquished its weight, but for the first time, he understood his agency. He could navigate this world, confront the consequences, and protect what was innocent. Outside, Brooklyn continued its indifferent rhythm. The city, unaware, slept under the weight of ordinary lives. Inside, Richard Olabode Richardson held a ledger that was more than a book, more than debt, more than danger. He held knowledge. He held responsibility. And he was ready. Months passed, and Brooklyn moved on, unaware of the unseen forces weaving through one apartment on a quiet Treeline street. Richard Olabode Richardson had changed. Not just in demeanor, not just in the quiet intensity of his gaze, but in the way he walked through the world, measured, aware, carrying responsibility like a second skin. The ledger remained on a shelf, its pages glowing faintly at night, waiting, watching, guiding. He no longer feared it. He had learned to consult it judiciously, understanding its rhythms, its patterns, its rules. It was a tool of knowledge, not merely a source of terror. Samuel returned, months later, not as a predator, but as a reluctant ally. The ledger had shifted their relationship from one of betrayal to one of enforced accountability. Samuel, clever and ambitious, now answered questions and provided guidance, revealing fragments of the debt's ancient history. Together, they began to untangle the threads of promises, obligations, and debts passed down through generations. Richard had returned to work, cautiously. The consulting firm that had once been his lifeline was now a stage for something greater. He negotiated, he advised, but always with awareness of the ledger's subtle influence. The ledger guided ethical choices, revealed hidden risks, and warned of consequences no one else could perceive. He rebuilt what had been lost, not just his savings, but his understanding of responsibility. Money and comfort were secondary. Knowledge, vigilance, and moral courage mattered most. He occasionally thought of Lagos, of the forest, of the blind girl. He had never seen her again, but her warning lingered like a whisper in the ledger's quiet pulse. You carry something you should not. Handle it wisely. Richard also began to repair his relationship with his father. James Richardson had never understood the pull of heritage, but the ordeal had changed Richard. He spoke not of money or danger, but of choices, obligations, and accountability. Slowly, their bond deepened, grounded not in shared culture, but in shared responsibility. The ledger, ever patient, ever demanding, had reshaped him. It had made him vigilant, morally accountable, and resilient. Richard now understood that safety was not a place or distance. It was consciousness, attention, and endurance. At night, he sometimes glanced at the shadows stretching across his apartment walls, and they no longer threatened. They waited, as they always had, but they acknowledged him now as a participant. He had survived the tasks, faced the betrayer, and carried the debt consciously. And somewhere, in the quiet spaces between the ledger's pages, the blind woman's voice whispered once more. Balance begins with understanding. Endurance follows knowledge. You are ready, Richard Olabode Richardson. The path continues, but you walk it willingly. Richard leaned back in his chair, ledger in hand, and for the first time in years, allowed himself to feel not fear, but clarity. He had returned from chaos and survived not by luck, not by fleeing, but by facing the truth, and in doing so, he had finally reclaimed himself. The city slept, oblivious. The ledger pulsed. And Richard, fully aware, fully awake, prepared for whatever came next. 5 years had passed since Richard first returned from Lagos. Brooklyn had changed, as all cities do, but Richard had changed more. He no longer walked through life in a fog of fear and indecision. His hair had grown darker with age, flecked slightly with gray at the temples, a quiet testament to endurance. His posture was straighter, his presence calmer, yet every glance suggested a man who had seen far more than he should have. The ledger remained on a shelf in his apartment, its glow now subdued, almost serene. It had become part of his life, not a terror looming over it. Every so often, it would pulse with urgency, reminding him that vigilance never ended. The tasks had evolved into responsibilities, choices to prevent harm, to guide others, to untangle consequences that spanned continents. Richard had learned to read it, to interpret its messages as guidance rather than threat. Samuel had returned intermittently, bound by obligation and the ledger's invisible rules. Their relationship, once fractured by betrayal, had shifted into a delicate, cautious partnership. Samuel revealed more of the debt's ancient origins, contracts signed in desperation, obligations passed through bloodlines, bargains struck with forces that operated beyond mortal comprehension. Together, they worked quietly to balance the scales, each learning from the other. Samuel's cunning was tempered by Richard's moral awareness, forming a careful symmetry. Richard had also rebuilt his life outwardly. The consulting firm had welcomed him back, but he no longer measured success by money alone. He advised, mentored, and guided, not for profit, but for the ethical outcomes the ledger often highlighted. Clients, unknowingly, were sometimes guided by Richard's subtle interventions, protecting them from the invisible consequences of greed and haste. His relationship with his father had grown too. James Richardson had come to understand, in a way, that the ledger and its debts were not about superstition but about accountability. Their conversations deepened, exploring morality, heritage, and responsibility. The gulf that had once separated them had narrowed, though the past was never fully erased. One crisp November evening, Richard stood on the rooftop of his building, looking at the skyline. The Hudson glimmered like molten silver. The ledger was open beside him, glowing faintly, its pages filled with annotations, observations, and a map of obligations still unresolved. Shadows lingered at the corners of the rooftop, but now they seemed patient, almost protective. "You've grown into your role," a voice said. Samuel stepped from the darkness, older, wearier, but carrying the same cold intelligence. "You could have failed. Most do. But you endure." Richard closed the ledger, feeling the weight but also the purpose it carried. "I didn't just survive," he said. "I learned. I understand now. The ledger doesn't control me. I choose how to wield it." Samuel's smile was faint but genuine. "And that is why you are still standing. That is why the debt has not consumed us yet." Richard turned to the skyline. The city below moved with its usual indifference. Cars, lights, people living ordinary lives, oblivious to the centuries of obligation threading invisibly through the world. But Richard understood. Safety, freedom, and even power were illusions without vigilance, knowledge, and moral courage. He carried the ledger not for fear or for gain, but for balance. The blind woman's voice whispered in memory. "Balance begins with understanding. Endurance follows knowledge." Richard smiled faintly. He had endured. He understood. And he would continue to do both. A gentle breeze stirred, and for the first time in years, Richard felt a calm he had not known since Lagos. He looked at Samuel, then at the ledger, then at the city sprawled beneath them. The path would always continue. The ledger would always demand vigilance. But Richard Olabode Richardson, hardened, wise, and fully awake, was ready. He stepped back from the rooftop, the city alive beneath his feet, shadows and ledger pulsing faintly behind him, and for the first time in a lifetime, he felt the fragile, enduring certainty of agency, that while the world might press endlessly, he would walk it willingly, consciously, and unafraid. The ledger had made him more than survivor. It had made him participant, guardian, and, finally, master of his own destiny. It was early spring, and Brooklyn streets were waking under a pale morning sun. Richard walked along a quiet avenue near the park, the ledger tucked into a satchel at his side. Its glow was faint now, almost imperceptible, but he could feel it pulsing gently, like a heartbeat attuned to his own. He stopped outside a small cafe, where a young man, mid-20s, nervous and clutching a worn briefcase, waited. Richard studied him for a moment. There was a shadow about the youth, subtle, almost imperceptible, the weight of fear, inexperience, and perhaps a debt not yet acknowledged. "You came?" Richard asked softly. The young man nodded, hesitating. I think I need guidance. Someone to help me see clearly. I'm in over my head." Richard smiled faintly, thinking of the terrified man he had once been, barely escaping Lagos with nothing but instinct and luck. "I understand," he said, "but it's not about luck. It's about knowledge, awareness, responsibility. Those who understand their obligations have a chance. Those who ignore them, they don't last long." He led the young man into the cafe, a quiet place with sunlight spilling across the tables, and sat him down. Opening the ledger, Richard revealed the faint glow of its pages, not intimidating now, but inviting. "This," Richard said, his voice calm, "is more than a book. It's a record, a guide, a map of choices, consequences, and obligations you may not even know you carry. And sometimes, it chooses the one who will see it fully. You can ignore it, or you can learn. But once you understand, you can't turn away. The young man's eyes widened. I don't understand, what is it? Richard leaned forward. It is a ledger of responsibility. Not punishment, not wealth, not power, but knowledge of what threads tie us to the past, and how our choices ripple forward. It shows you the debts, the promises, the obligations that shape life beyond what you see. It will test you, guide you, and if you endure, it will help you protect what matters most. He closed the ledger gently, the glow fading but leaving warmth in his hands. You're ready to learn, but remember this. It doesn't make decisions for you. You must choose. Conscious choice is the only true power. Outside, the city moved on. Morning traffic hummed, children's laughter echoed from the park, and the sun painted the streets gold. But inside the cafe, a small corner of Brooklyn, Richard Olabode Richardson held a young man's attention with the ledger before him, a new participant in an ancient chain of responsibility, a new guardian being initiated. And somewhere unseen, the shadows watched, patient and eternal. The ledger pulsed faintly, its knowledge extending through time, carrying the past into the hands of those willing to endure. Richard leaned back, letting the sunlight touch his face. He had survived the forest, survived betrayal, survived the debt. And now, he was ensuring that the lessons, the vigilance, and the wisdom he had fought to grasp would continue. Through him, through another, and perhaps through generations yet to come. The ledger had chosen him once. Now it chose again. And the cycle continued. Richard watched the young man leave the cafe, the first steps of a new journey, uncertain but deliberate. Outside, Brooklyn shimmered with ordinary life, yet he knew what lay beneath the veneer of streets and skyline. The ledger rested quietly in his satchel, neither threatening nor benign, but alive with the accumulated weight of choices and consequences. He thought of Lagos, of Samuel, of the blind woman and her whispered warnings. All of it had brought him here, not merely to survive, but to understand, to endure, to guide. The ledger had not ended his story. It had begun a continuum, a chain of responsibility that stretched backward into the shadows of his ancestors and forward into the unknown futures of those yet to bear it. Richard inhaled deeply, feeling the city's rhythm, its indifference, and its hidden connections. Safety, he realized, was not a place. It was awareness. It was courage. It was the willingness to carry what must be carried and to act where others falter. The ledger pulsed faintly, a soft heartbeat against his own. He did not fear it. He did not expect it to relinquish its lessons. He merely respected it. And in that respect, he had found power, not the power to command, but the power to endure, to protect, and to choose consciously. Above the city, shadows lengthened as evening approached, yet Richard Olabode Richardson stood unshaken, fully awake, fully present. The ledger's glow lingered at his side, patient, eternal, and inexorably bound to him. The world would continue in ignorance, unaware of the debts, promises, and forces threading silently through every life. But Richard had seen. Richard had endured. And Richard would continue. Because some legacies cannot be ignored. Some burdens cannot be cast aside. And some choices, once made, carry the weight of eternity. The ledger waited, as it always had and always would, for the next step, the next decision, the next guardian. And Richard was ready. Richard Olabode Richardson had crossed oceans, endured betrayal, faced ancient debts, and confronted forces both human and mysterious. From the suffocating terror of a forest in Lagos to the quiet shadows of his Brooklyn apartment, he had lost everything, only to discover that survival alone was not enough. The ledger, a living record of obligations and consequences, had become his guide, his burden, and his instrument of understanding. Through its subtle instruction, he had learned to navigate trust and deception, to discern danger and responsibility, and to wield knowledge as a shield. Samuel, once a betrayer, became an uneasy ally, The blind seer's warning echoed in every choice, and the world, indifferent and unaware, moved on as Richard assumed the mantle of vigilant guardian. He had endured, adapted, and emerged not merely as a survivor, but as a participant in a continuum of legacy and accountability. And as he mentored a new generation, passing on the hard-earned lessons of foresight, courage, and conscious choice, Richard understood the truth the ledger had always revealed. Some burdens cannot be escaped, some debts cannot be denied, and some shadows, patient and eternal, demand guardians who are fully awake. That night, Richard sat by the window. The city sprawled below like a patchwork of lights and shadows. The ledger rested on the coffee table, its faint glow illuminating the room just enough to make the edges of the pages shimmer. He had spent the evening reviewing notes, tracking unresolved threads and marking small victories, debts repaid, obligations balanced, chaos averted. Yet the ledger pulsed subtly, a reminder that the work was never done. A soft knock echoed at the door. Richard's hand went instinctively to the satchel containing the ledger. No one had ever come to his apartment unannounced, not since his return. He opened the door slowly. A young woman, perhaps in her early 20s, stood there. Her eyes were clear, steady, but there was a tension about her, the same tension Richard remembered seeing in himself the first time the ledger had revealed its weight. "Richard Olabode Richardson?" she asked, her voice calm but urgent. "I was told you could help, that you understand." He studied her, recognizing in her presence the same pull he had felt years ago, the call of obligations unseen, debts carried in shadows, choices yet unmade. He nodded once, deliberately, firmly. "Come in," he said. "There's much you need to know, and very little time to learn it." As she stepped into the apartment, the ledger's glow brightened slightly, as if acknowledging a new participant, a new thread woven into the continuum. Outside, the city breathed its indifferent rhythm, unaware of the ancient forces stirring within a single room. Shadows stretched quietly across the walls, patient, eternal. The ledger pulsed once, a heartbeat of knowledge and vigilance, and Richard realized that the path would never truly end. But he was ready, and so it began again. The young woman settled into the chair across from Richard, her fingers gripping the edge of the seat. The ledger lay open between them, its glow illuminating the intricate symbols on its pages. She glanced down at them, hesitation flickering in her eyes. "I don't even know where to start," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard leaned back, studying her carefully. "You start by understanding one simple truth," he said. "The ledger does not punish. It observes. It records. And it guides. Everything you see here, every symbol, every annotation, is connected to choices, debts, obligations that most people will never even perceive. Ignoring them doesn't erase them. Acting without understanding can make matters far worse." She nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of his words. "So, it's like a map?" "Yes," Richard said, "but it's more than a map. It's a living record. It reacts. It teaches. And it chooses who can read it." His eyes softened slightly, remembering his own first encounter years ago. "I was chosen, just as you are now. And the ledger will test you. It will push you to confront truths about yourself, your family, and the world. It will force you to see shadows you didn't know existed." The young woman swallowed hard, her gaze flicking from the glowing pages to Richard's steady eyes. "And if I fail?" Richard's expression darkened, but not with anger, only gravity. "Failure isn't always death. Sometimes it's something worse. Ignorance, regret, and the consequences that ripple through others' lives. The ledger doesn't forgive mistakes. It only offers the chance to correct them before the damage spreads." He reached across the table and gently turned a page, revealing a diagram of interconnected lines and annotations that pulsed faintly. "Every obligation has a history," he continued. "Every choice we make echoes backward and forward. Some debts pass through bloodlines, some through circumstance, some through forces beyond human comprehension. Understanding these patterns, that is what separates those who endure from those who are consumed." The young woman leaned closer, fascination and fear battling in her expression. "And Samuel?" she asked tentatively, almost afraid of the answer. Richard's jaw tightened. "He is complicated. Once, he was my betrayer. Now, he is a necessary part of the Ledger's network. Clever, resourceful, willing to manipulate for survival, but he also understands, to some degree, the rules it enforces. That doesn't mean I trust him. It means I watch him carefully, as the Ledger would have me do." She shivered, instinctively. "And the shadows, the ones you said are patient, eternal?" Richard looked toward the window, where faint shapes of night moved across the walls. "They are consequences waiting to be met, debts waiting to be acknowledged, lessons waiting to be learned. They have existed long before you or I, and they will continue long after. The Ledger is our guide through them, but only if we pay attention, only if we choose consciously. Otherwise, it's easy to be swept away." For a long moment, the room was silent except for the Ledger's gentle pulse. The young woman swallowed again, steeling herself. Then, "I want to learn. I want to understand." Richard nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "Then you begin," he said. "And I warn you, this path is not simple. It is not safe. But it is necessary. Every choice you make will matter. Every step will count. And the Ledger, it will be there to guide you. Every moment." Outside, Brooklyn slept. The city moved on, oblivious. Shadows waited. And inside the small apartment, a new guardian had begun her first lessons under the watchful eye of Richard Olabode Richardson and the ever-pulsing Ledger. The cycle had started again. "If you want, I can continue,"